Emotions Revealed by Ekman. Introduction. Emotions determine the quality of our lives. They occur in every relationship we care about, in the workplace, in our friendships, in dealing with family members, and in our most intimate relationships. They can save our lives, but they can also cause real damage. They may lead us to act in ways that we think are realistic and appropriate, but our emotions can also lead us to act in ways that we regret terribly afterwards. If your boss was to criticize the report you thought she would praise, would you react with fear and become submissive rather than defend your work? Would that protect you from further harm, or might you have misunderstood what she was up to? Could you hide what you were feeling and act professional? Why would your boss smile when she started to talk? Could she be relishing the prospect of chewing you out, or could that be the smile of embarrassment? Could her smile have been meant to reassure you? Are all smiles the same? If we were to confront your spouse with the discovery of a big purchase that he had not discussed with you, would you know if it was fear or disgust he showed, or if he was pulling the face he shows when he is waiting out what he calls your overly emotional behavior? Do you feel emotions the same way he does, the same way other people do? Do you get angry or afraid or sad about matters that don't seem to bother others? And is there anything that you can do about that? Would you get angry if you were to hear that your 16-year-old daughter came home 2 hours after her curfew? What would trigger the anger? Would it be the fear you felt each time you checked the clock and realized that she hadn't called to say that she would be late? Or the sleep you lost waiting for her to come home? The next morning, when you talked to her about it, would you be able to control your anger so well that she would think you really didn't care about the curfew? Or would she see your stifled anger and become defensive? Could you know from the look on her face if she was embarrassed, guilty, or a bit defiant? I have written this book to provide answers to such questions. My goal is to help readers better understand and improve their emotional life. It still amazes me that up until very recently, we, both scientists and laymen, know so little about emotion, given its importance in our lives. But it is in the nature of emotion itself that we would not fully know how emotions influence us and how to recognize their signs in ourselves and others, all matters I explain in this book. Emotions can and often do begin very quickly, so quickly in fact that our conscious self does not participate in or even witness what in our mind triggers an emotion at any particular moment. That speed can save our lives in an emergency, but it can also ruin our lives when we overreact. We don't have much control over what we become emotional about, but it is possible, though not easy, to make some changes in what triggers our emotions and how we behave when we are emotional. I have been studying emotions for more than 40 years, focusing primarily on the expression and more recently on the physiology of emotion. I have examined psychiatric patients, normal individuals, adults, and some children in this country and many other countries when they overreact, underreact, react inappropriately, lie, and tell the truth. Chapter 1, Emotions Across Cultures, describes this research, the platform from which I speak. In Chapter 2, I ask the question, why do we become emotional when we do? If we are to change what we become emotional about, we must know the answer to that question. What triggers each of our emotions? Can we remove a particular trigger? If our spouse tells us about taking the long route to get to a destination, annoyance or even anger may boil up within us at being directed and having our driving acumen criticized. Why couldn't we accept the information without getting emotional? Why does it get to us? Can we change so that such minor matters don't make us emotional? These issues are discussed in Chapter 2. When do we become emotional? In Chapter 3, I explain how and when we can change what we become emotional about. The first step is to identify the hot emotional triggers that lead us to act in ways we subsequently regret. We also need to be able to identify whether a particular trigger is going to resist change or be more easily weakened. We won't always succeed, but we can. Through understanding how emotional triggers become established, have a better chance of changing what we become emotional about. In Chapter 4, I explain how our emotional responses, our expressions, actions, and thoughts are organized. Can we manage irritation so it doesn't appear in our voice or show on our face? Why does it sometimes feel as though our emotions are a runaway train and as though we have no control over them? We don't have a chance unless we can become more aware of when we are acting emotionally. Very often we are not aware until someone objects to what we have done or until we reflect later. Chapter 4 explains how we can become more attentive to our emotions as we have them so that there is the possibility of behaving emotionally in constructive ways. To reduce destructive emotional episodes and enhance constructive emotional episodes, we need to know the story of each emotion, what each emotion is about. By learning the triggers for each emotion, the ones we share with others and those that are uniquely our own, we may be able to lessen their impact or at least learn why some of the emotion triggers are so powerful that they resist any attempt to lessen their control over our life. Each emotion also generates a unique pattern of sensations in our body. By becoming better acquainted with these sensations, we may become aware early enough in our emotional response that we have some chance to choose, if we like, whether to go along or to interfere with the emotion. Each emotion also has unique signals, the most identifiable being in the face and the voice. There still is much research to do on vocal emotional signals, but the photographs provided in chapters on each emotion show the most subtle, easy to miss facial expressions that signal when an emotion is just beginning or when it is being suppressed. With the ability to identify emotions early on, we may better be able to understand and deal with people in a variety of situations and manage our own emotional responses to their feelings. Separate chapters describe sadness and anguish, Chapter 5, anger, Chapter 6, surprise and fear, Chapter 7, disgust and contempt, Chapter 8, and the many kinds of enjoyment, Chapter 9, with sections covering the most common specific triggers for the emotion, the function of the emotion, how it serves us and how it can get us in trouble, how the emotion is involved in mental disorders, exercises that will improve the reader's ability of the bodily sensations involved in the emotion, increasing the ability that readers will be able to choose how they act when they are emotional, photographs of the subtlest sign of the emotion in others, so readers will be more aware of how others are feeling, an explanation of how to use this information about how others are feeling in your relationships, in the workplace, your family, and in friendships. The appendix provides a test you can take before reading the book to find out how well you are able to recognize subtle facial expressions. You might want to take that test again when you finish to see if you have improved. You might wonder why one of the emotions you're curious about doesn't appear in this book. I have chosen to describe the emotions we know are universal, experienced by all human beings. Embarrassment, guilt, shame, and envy are probably universal, but I have focused instead on the emotions that have clear universal expressions. I discuss love in the chapter on enjoyable emotions, violence, hate, and jealousy in the chapter on anger. Science is still delving into the ways each of us experiences the emotions, why some of us have more intense emotional experiences or tend to be emotional quickly. And I conclude the book with what we are learning, what we might learn, and how you can use this information in your own life. It is hard to overestimate the importance of emotions in our life. My mentor, the late Sylvan Tompkins, said emotions are what motivate our lives. We organize our lives to maximize the experience of positive emotions and minimize the experience of negative emotions. We do not always succeed, but this is what we try to do. He claimed that emotion motivates all the important choices we make. Writing in 1962, a time when emotions were completely neglected in the behavioral science, Sylvan overstated the matter, for surely there can be other motives, but emotions are important, very important in our life. Emotions can override what most psychologists have rather simple-mindedly considered the more powerful fundamental motives that drive our lives: hunger, sex, and the will to survive. People will not eat if they think the only food available is disgusting. They may even die, although other people might consider that same food palatable. Emotion triumphs over the hunger drive. The sex drive is notoriously vulnerable to the interference of emotions. A person may never attempt sexual contact because of the interference of fear or disgust, or may never be able to complete a sexual act. Emotion triumphs over the sex drive, and despair can overwhelm even the will to live, motivating a suicide. Emotions triumph over the will to live. Put simply, people want to be happy, and most of us don't want to experience fear, anger, disgust, sadness, or anguish unless it is in the safe confines of a theater or between the covers of a novel. Yet, as I will explain later, we couldn't live without these emotions. The issue is how to live better with them. Emotions across cultures. I have included in this book all that I have learned about emotions during the past 40 years that I believe can be helpful in improving one's own emotional life. Most of what I have written is supported by my own scientific experiments or research of other emotion scientists, but not everything. My own research specifically was to develop expertise in reading and measuring facial expressions of emotions. So equipped, I have been able to see on the faces of strangers, friends, and family members subtleties that nearly everyone else misses. And by that means I have learned a great deal more than I have yet had the time to prove through experiments. When what I write is based just on my observations, I note that by the phrase, such as I have observed, I believe, it seems to me. And when I write based on scientific experiments, I cite in endnotes the scientific research supporting what I say. Much of what I have written in this book was influenced by my own cross-cultural studies of facial expressions. The evidence changed forever my view of psychology in general and of emotion in particular. Those findings in places as varied as Papua New Guinea, the United States, Japan, Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, and the former Soviet Union led me to develop my ideas about the nature of emotion. At the start of my research in the late 1950s, I wasn't even interested in facial expression. It was the movements of the hands that drew my interest. My method of classifying hand movements distinguished neurotic from depressed patients and indicated how much the patient improved from treatment. In the early 1960s, there wasn't even a tool for directly and precisely measuring the complex, often rapidly changing facial movement shown by the depressed patients. I had no idea where to begin, and so I didn't. 25 years later, after I had developed a tool for measuring facial movement, I returned to those patient films and unearthed important findings, which I describe in Chapter 5. I don't think I would have shifted my research focus to facial expression than emotion in 1965 if it hadn't been for two strokes of luck. Through serendipity, the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense gave me a grant to do cross-cultural studies of nonverbal behavior. I had not sought the grant, but because of a scandal, a research project being used to camouflage counterinsurgency activity, a major ARPA project was canceled, and the money budgeted for it had to be spent during that fiscal year on overseas research and on something non-controversial. By accident, I happened to walk into the office of the man who had to spend the funds. He was married to a woman from Thailand and was impressed by differences in their nonverbal communication. He wanted me to find out what was universal and what was culturally variable. I was reluctant at first, but I couldn't walk away from the challenge. I began the project believing that expression and gesture were socially learned and culturally variable, and so did the initial group of people I asked for advice: Margaret Mead, Gregory Bateson, Edward Hall, Ray Bird Whitestell, and Charles Osgood. I recalled that Charles Darwin had made the opposite claim, but I was so convinced that he was wrong that I didn't bother to read his book. The second stroke of luck was meeting Sylvan Tompkins. He had just written 2 books about emotion in which he claimed that facial expressions were innate and universal to our species, but he had no evidence to back his claim. I don't think I would have ever read his books or met him if we hadn't both submitted articles on nonverbal behavior to the same journal at the same time. Sylvan's A Study of the Face, Mind, A Study of a Body Movement. I was very impressed with the depth and breadth of Sylvan's thinking, but I thought he was probably wrong in his belief, like Darwin's, that expressions were innate and therefore universal. I was delighted that there were two sides to the argument, and that it wasn't just Darwin, who had written 100 years earlier, who opposed Mead, Bateson, Burt Whitestell, and Hall. It wasn't a dead issue. There was a real argument between famous scientists, elder statesmen, and I, at the age of 30, had the chance and the funding to try to settle it once and for all. Are expressions universal, or are they like language specific to each culture? Irresistible. I really didn't care who proved to be correct, although I didn't think it would be Sylvan. In my first study, I showed photographs to people in 5 cultures: Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Japan, and the United States, and asked them to judge what emotion was shown in each facial expression. The majority in every culture agreed, suggesting that expressions might really be universal. Carol Izzard, another psychologist who had been advised by Sylvan and was working in other cultures, did nearly the same experiment and got the same results. Tompkin had not told either of us about the other, something that we initially resented when we found out we were not doing this work alone. But it was better for science that 2 independent researchers found the same thing. It seemed that Darwin was right. There was a problem. How could we have found that people from many different cultures agreed about what emotion was shown in an expression when so many smart people thought just the opposite? It wasn't just the travelers who claimed that the expressions of the Japanese or the Chinese or some other cultural group had very different meanings. Burt Whitestell, a respected anthropologist who specialized in the study of expression and gesture, a protege of Margaret Mead, had written that he abandoned Darwin's idea when he found that in many cultures, people smiled when they were unhappy. Burt Whitestell's claim fit the view that dominated cultural anthropology and most of psychology. Anything socially important, such as emotional expressions, must be the product of learning and therefore different in each culture. I reconciled our findings that expressions are universal with Burt Whitestell's observation of how they differ from one culture to another by coming up with the idea of display rules. These, I proposed, are socially learned, often culturally different, rules about the management of expression, about who can show which expression and emotion to whom and when they can do so. It is why in most public sporting contests, the loser doesn't show the sadness and disappointment he or she feels. Display rules are embodied in the parent's admonition. Get that smirk off your face. These rules may dictate that we diminish, exaggerate, hide completely, or mask the expression of emotion we are feeling. I tested this formulation in a series of studies that showed that when alone, Japanese and Americans displayed the same facial expressions in response to seeing films of surgery and accidents. But when a scientist sat with them as they watched the films, the Japanese, more than the Americans, masked negative expressions with a smile. In private, innate expressions. In public, managed expressions. Since it is the public behavior that anthropologists and most travelers observe, I had my explanation and evidence of its operation. In contrast, symbolic gestures such as a head nod yes, the head shake no, and the A-OK gesture are indeed cultural specific. Here, Burt Whitestell, Mead, and most other behavioral scientists were right, though they were wrong about the facial expressions of emotion. There was a loophole, and I could see it. So might Burt Whitestell and me, who I knew would search for any way to dismiss my findings. All the people I and Izzard had studied might have learned the meaning of Western facial expressions by watching Charlie Chaplin and John Wayne on the movie screen and the television tube. Learning from the media or having contact with people from other cultures could explain why people from different cultures have agreed about the emotions shown in my photographs of Caucasians. I needed a visually isolated culture where the people had not seen movies, no television, no magazines, and few, if any, outsiders. If they thought the same emotions were shown in my set of facial expressions photographs as the people in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Japan, and the United States, I would have nailed it. My entry to a Stone Age culture was Carlton a neurologist who had been working for more than a decade in such isolated places in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. He was trying to find the cause of a strange disease, kuru, which was killing about half the people in one of these cultures. The people believed it was due to sorcery. When I arrived on the scene, already knew that it was due to a slow virus, a virus that incubates for many years before any symptoms become apparent. He didn't yet know how it was transmitted. It turned out to be cannibalism. These people didn't eat their enemies, who would be more likely to be in good health if they died in combat. They ate only their friends who died of some kind of disease, many of them from kuru. They didn't cook them before eating, so diseases were rapidly passed on. Some years later won the Nobel Prize for the discovery of slow viruses. Fortunately, Jakasuke had realized that Stone Age cultures would soon disappear, so he took more than 100,000 feet of motion picture films of the daily lives of the people in each of two cultures. He had never looked at the films. It would have taken nearly 6 weeks to look just once at his film of these people. That's when I came along. Delighted that someone had a scientific reason for wanting to examine his films, he lent me copies. And my colleague, Wally Frizen, and I spent 6 months carefully examining them. The films contained 2 very convincing proofs of the universality of facial expressions of emotion. First, we never saw an unfamiliar expression. If facial expressions are completely learned, then these isolated people should have shown novel expressions, ones we had never seen before. There were none. It was still possible that these familiar expressions might be signals of very different emotions. But while the film didn't always reveal what happened before or after an expression, when they did, they confirmed our interpretations. If expressions signal different emotions in each culture, then total outsiders with no familiarity with the culture should not be able to interpret the expressions correctly. I tried to think how Burt Whitestell and Mead would dispute these claims. I imagine they would say it doesn't matter that there aren't any new expressions. The ones you did see really have different meanings. You got them right because you were tipped off by the social context in which they were occurring. You never saw an expression removed from what was happening before, afterward, or at the same time. If you had, you wouldn't have known what the expression meant. To close this loophole, we brought Sylvan from the East Coast to spend a week at my lab. Before he came, we edited the films so he would see only the expressions itself, removed from its social context, just close-up shots of a face. Sylvan had no trouble at all. Every one of his interpretations fit the social context he hadn't seen. What's more, he knew exactly how he got the information. Wally and I could sense what emotional message was conveyed by each expression, but our judgments were intuitively based. We usually could not specify exactly what in the face carried the message unless it was a smile. Sylvan walked up to the movie screen and pointed out exactly which specific muscular movements signaled the emotion. We also asked him for his overall impression of these two cultures. One group, he said, seems quite friendly. The other was explosive with their anger, highly suspicious, if not paranoid in character, and homosexual. It was the anger that he was describing. His account fit what we had been told by Jakasuke, who had worked with them. They had repeatedly attacked Australian officials who tried to maintain a government station there. They were known by their neighbors for their fierce suspiciousness, and the men led homosexual lives until the time of marriage. A few years later, the ethologist Irenaeus Ebefet literally had to run for his life when he attempted to work with them. After that meeting, I decided to devote myself to the study of facial expression. I would go to New Guinea and try to get evidence to support what I knew to be true, that at least some facial expressions or emotions are universal. and I would work to develop an objective way to measure facial behavior so that any scientist could objectively derive from facial movement what Sylvan could see so keenly. Late in 1967, I went to the Southeast Highlands to do research on the Four people who lived in small, scattered villages at the elevation of 7,000 feet. I did not know the Four language, but with the help of a few boys who had learned Pidgin from a missionary school, I could go from English to Pidgin to Four and back again. I brought with me pictures of facial expressions, mostly pictures that I had been given by Sylvan for my studies of literate cultures. I also brought photographs of some Four people I had selected from the motion picture film, thinking they might have trouble interpreting the expressions shown by Caucasians. I even worried that they might not be able to understand photographs at all, never having seen them before. Some anthropologists had earlier claimed that people who hadn't seen photographs had to learn how to interpret them. The Four had no such problem, though they immediately understood the photographs and didn't seem to make such of a difference what nationality the person was, Four or American. The problem was what I asked them to do. They had no written language, so I couldn't ask them to pick a word from a list that fit the emotion shown. If I were to read them a list of emotion words, I would have to worry about whether they remembered the list and whether the order in which the words were read influenced their choice. Instead, I asked them to make up a story about each facial expression. Tell me what is happening now, what happened before to make this person show this expression, and what is going to happen next. It was like pulling teeth. I'm not certain whether it was the translation process or the fact that they had no idea what it was I wanted to hear or why I wanted them to do this. Perhaps making up stories about strangers was just something the Four didn't do. I did get my stories, but it took each person a lot of time to give me each story. They and I were exhausted after each session. Nevertheless, I had no shortage of volunteers, even though I suspect the word was out that what I was asking wasn't easy to do. There was a powerful incentive to look at my photographs. I gave each person either a bar of soap or a pack of cigarettes for helping me. They had no soap, so it was highly valued. They grew their own tobacco, which they smoked in pipes, but they seemed to like my cigarettes better. Most of their stories fit the emotion each photograph supposedly dictated. For example, when looking at a picture depicting what people in literate cultures judged as saddest, the New Guineas most often said that the person's child had died, but the storytelling procedure was awkward, and proving that the different stories fit a particular emotion would not be an easy task. I knew I had to do it differently, but I didn't know how. I also filmed spontaneous expressions and was able to catch the look of joy when people from another nearby village met their friends. I arranged situations to provoke emotions. I recorded two men playing their musical instruments, and then I filmed their surprise and delight when for the first time they heard their voices and music come out of a tape recorder. I even stabbed a boy with a rubber knife I had brought with me. As my movie camera recorded his response and reactions of his friends, they thought it was a good joke. I had the good sense not to try this trick with one of the men. Such film clips could not serve as my evidence for those committed to the view that expressions differing in each culture could always argue I had selected only from these few occasions when universal expressions were shown. I left New Guinea after a few months, not a hard decision because I was hungry for conversation, something I couldn't have with any other people, and for food, since I had made the mistake of thinking I would enjoy eating the local cuisine, yams and something resembling the part of the asparagus we discard grew pretty tiresome. It was an adventure, the most exciting one of my life, but I was still worried that I had not been able to get definitive evidence. I knew this culture would not stay isolated much longer, and there was not many others like it still left in the world. Back home, I came across a technique that psychologist John Dashiell had used in the 1930s to study how well young children could interpret facial expressions. They were too young to read, so he couldn't give them a list of words from which to choose. Instead of asking them to make up a story, as I had done in New Guinea, Dashiell cleverly read them a story and showed them a set of pictures. All they had to do was pick the one that fit the story. I knew that would work for me. I went over the stories and the New Guineans had made up, picking the story that had been the most often for each type of emotional expression. They were pretty simple. His or her friends have come and she is happy. She is angry and about to fight. His or her child has died and she feels very sad. He is looking at something he or she dislikes, or he or she is looking at something that smells bad. He or she is just now looking at something new and unexpected. There was a problem with the most frequent story for fear because the danger posed by a wild pig. I had to change it to reduce the chance that it would be relevant to surprise or anger. It went like this. He or she is sitting in his or her home all alone, and there is no one else in the village. There is no knife, axe, or bow, an arrow in the house. A wild pig is standing in the door of the house, and the man or woman is looking at the pig and is very afraid of it. The pig has been standing in the doorway for a few moments, and the person is looking at it very afraid, and the pig won't move away from the door, and he or she is afraid the pig will bite him or her. I made up sets of 3 pictures, which would be shown while one of the stories was read. The subject would have to point to the picture. I made up many sets of pictures. I didn't want any picture to appear more than once, so the person's choice wouldn't be by exclusion. Oh, that was the one where the child died, and that was the one I said she was about to fight. So this one must be the one about the pig. I returned to New Guinea in 1968 with my stones, my pictures, and a team of colleagues to help gather the data. This time I also brought canned food. Our return was heralded, I suppose because apart from Gatchusaki and his filmmaker Richard Sorensen, who was of great help to me in the prior year, very few outsiders ever visited, and even fewer returned. We did travel to some villages, but once the word got out that what we were asking was very easy to do, people from villages far away started coming to us. They liked the task and were again delighted with the soap and cigarettes. I took special care to ensure that no one in our group would unwittingly tip off the subjects as to which pictures was the correct one. The sets of pictures were mounted onto transparent pages with a code number written on the back of the picture that could be seen from the back side of the page. We did not know and made a point of not knowing which codes went with each expression. Instead, a page would be turned toward the subject, arranged so that the person writing down the answers would not be able to see the front of the page. The story would be read, the subject would point to the picture, and one of us would write down the code number for the picture of the subject that was chosen. In the space of just a few weeks, we saw more than 300 people, about 3% of this culture, and more than enough to analyze statistically. The results were very clear-cut for happiness, anger, disgust, and sadness. Fear and surprise were not distinguished from each other when people heard the fear story. They just as often picked the surprise as a fear expression, and the same was true when they heard about the surprise story. But fear and surprise were distinguished from anger, disgust, sadness, and happiness. To this day, I do not know why fear and surprise were not distinguished from each other. It could have been a problem with the stories, or it could have been that these two emotions are so often intermingled in people's lives that they aren't distinguished. In literate cultures, fear and surprise are distinguished from each other. All except 23 of our subjects had seen no movies, television, or photographs. They neither spoke nor understood English or Pidgin, had not lived in any Western settlements or government town, and had never worked for a Caucasian. The 23 exceptions had all seen movies, spoke English, and had attended a missionary school for more than a year. There were no differences between the majority of the subjects who had little contact with the outside world and the few who had, nor were there any differences between males and females. We did one more experiment, which was not as easy as for our subjects. One of the Pidgin speakers read them one of the stories and asked them to show what their face would look like if they were the person in the story. I videotaped 9 men doing this, none of whom had participated in the first study. The unedited videotapes were shown to college students in America. If the expressions were culture specific, then these college students would not be able to interpret correctly the expression, but the Americans correctly identified the emotion except for fear and surprise poises, where they were equally likely to call the poise fear or surprise, just like the New Guineans. Here are 4 examples of the New Guineans' poises of emotion: enjoyment, sadness, anger, disgust. I announced our findings at the annual Anthropology National Conference in 1969. Many were unhappy with what we found. They were firmly convinced that human behavior is all nurture and not nature. Expressions must be different in each culture. Despite my evidence, the fact that I had actually found cultural differences in the management of facial expressions in my Japanese American study was not good enough. The best way to dispel their doubts would be to repeat the entire study in another pre-literate, isolated culture. Ideally, someone else should do it, preferably someone who wanted to prove me wrong. If such a person found what I found, that would enormously strengthen our cause. Because of another stroke of luck, the anthropologist Carl Heater did just that. Heater had recently come back from spending a few years studying the Dani, another isolated group in what is now called West Irian, part of Indonesia. Heater told me that must be something wrong with my research because the Dani didn't even have words for emotions. I offered to give him all of my research materials and teach him how to run the experiment the next time he went back to the Dani. His results perfectly replicated my findings, even down to the failure to distinguish between fear and surprise. Nevertheless, not all anthropologists are convinced, not even today, and there are a few psychologists, primarily those concerned with language, who complain that our work in literate cultures where we asked people to identify the emotion word that fit the expressions does not support universals, since the words for each emotion don't have perfect translations. How emotions are represented in language is, of course, the product of culture rather than evolution. But in studies of now more than 20 literate Western and Eastern cultures, the judgment made by the majority in each culture about what emotion is shown in an expression is the same. Despite translation problems, there has never been an instance in which the majority in 2 cultures ascribe a different emotion to the same expression. Never. And of course, our findings are not limited to studies in which people had to label a photograph with a single word. In New Guinea, we used stories about the emotional event. We also had them pose emotions. And in Japan, we actually measured facial behavior itself, showing that when people were alone, the same facial muscles moved when viewing an unpleasant film, whether the person was Japanese or American. Another critic disparaged our research in New Guinea because we used stories describing a social situation instead of single words. This critic presumed that emotions are words, which, of course, they are not. Words are representations of emotions, not the emotions themselves. Emotion is a process, a particular kind of automatic appraisal influenced by our evolutionary and personal past, in which we sense that something important to our welfare is occurring and a set of psychological changes and emotional behaviors begin to deal with the situation. Words are one way to deal with our emotions, and we do use words when emotional, but we cannot reduce emotion to words. No one knows exactly what message we get automatically when we see someone's facial expression. I suspect that words like anger or fear are not the usual messages conveyed when we are in the situation. We use those words when we talk about emotions. More often, the message we get is like what we had in the story. Not an abstract word, but some sense of what that person is going to do next, or what made the person feel the emotion. Another quite different type of evidence also supports Darwin's claim that facial expressions are universal, a product of our evolution. If expressions do not need to be learned, then those who are born congenitally blind should manifest similar expressions to those of sighted individuals. A number of studies have been done over the past 60 years, and repeatedly that is what has been found. especially for spontaneous facial expressions. Our cross-cultural findings provided the impetus to seek answers to a host of other questions about facial expressions. How many expressions can people make? Do expressions provide accurate or misleading information? Is every movement of the face a sign of an emotion? Can people lie with their faces as well as with their words? There was so much to do, so much to find. Now there are answers to all of these questions and more. I discovered how many expressions on a face can make, more than 10,000, and identified the ones that appear to be most central to the emotions. More than 20 years ago, Wally Friesman and I wrote the first Atlas of the Face, a systematic description in words, photographs, and films of how to measure facial movement in anatomical terms. As part of this work, I had to learn how to make every muscle movement on my own face. Sometimes to verify that the movement I was making was due to a specific muscle, I put a needle through my skin of my face to electrically stimulate and contract the muscle, producing an expression. In 1978, our tool for measuring the face, the facial action coding system, was published and is now being used by hundreds of scientists around the world to measure facial movements. And computer scientists are busily working on how to make this measurement automatic and speedy. I have since used the facial action coding system to study thousands of photographs and tens of thousands of filmed or videotaped facial expressions, measuring each muscular movement in each expression. I have learned about emotion by measuring the expressions of psychiatric patients and the expressions of patients with coronary heart disease. I have studied normal people when they appear on news shows such as CNN and in experiments in my laboratory in which I provoked emotions. In the last 20 years, I collaborated with other investigators to learn when and what is happening inside the body and in the brain when an emotional expression occurs on the face. Just as there are different expressions for anger, fear, disgust, and sadness, there appears to be different profiles of psychological changes in the bodily organ that generate unique feelings for each emotion. Science is just now determining the patterns of brain activity that underlie each emotion. Using the facial action coding system, we have identified the facial signs that betray a lie. What I have termed microexpressions, very fast facial movements lasting less than 1/5 of a second, are one important source of leakage, revealing an emotion a person is trying to conceal. A false expression can be betrayed in a number of ways. It is usually very slightly asymmetrical, and it lacks smoothness in the way it flows on and off the face. My work on lying has brought me into contact with judges, police, lawyers, the FBI, CIA, ATF, and similar agencies in some friendly countries. I have taught all these people how to determine more accurately whether someone is truthful or lying. This work has also given me the chance to study the facial expressions and emotions of spies, assassins, embezzlers, murderers, foreign national leaders, and others whom a professor would not ordinarily encounter. When I was more than halfway through writing this book, I had the opportunity to spend 5 days discussing destructive emotions with His Holiness the Dalai Lama. There were 6 other participants, scientists and philosophers who presented their ideas and joined in the discussion. Learning about our work and listening to the discussions provided me with new ideas that I have incorporated into this book. For the first time, I learned about the Tibetan Buddhist view of emotion, a very different perspective from which I hold in the West. I was amazed to find that the ideas I had been writing about in chapter 2 and 3 were compatible with the Buddhist view, in part, and the Buddhist view suggested extensions and refinements of my idea that led me to rewrite these chapters extensively. Most of all, I learned from His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, on many different levels, from the experimental to the intellectual, and I believe the book has benefited from my learning. This is not a book about a Buddhist view on emotion, but I do occasionally mention parts of overlap and times when that meeting sparked particular insights. One of the most active new areas of research is our brain mechanisms of emotion. What I write is informed by that work, but we don't yet know enough about the brain to answer many of the questions I discuss in this book. We do know a lot about emotional behavior. enough to provide answers to some of the most central questions about the role of emotions in our everyday life. What I write in the next chapters is primarily based on my own research on emotional behavior, having examined in fine detail what I see people do in many different emotional situations in many different cultures, and learning from that what I think people need to know in order to understand their emotions better. Although my research and the findings of others provide the basis for what I describe in this book, I have reached beyond what has been proven scientifically to include also what I believe to be true, but is not yet proven. I have addressed some of the issues about which I think people who seek to improve their emotional life want to know. Preparing this book has given me new understandings of emotions, and I hope it will do the same for you.